Let's continue then with our theme as we focus on the safety of children. I mean, there are calls for the strengthening of protection of children. South Africa every year marks National Child Protection Week. We also are now inching closer to the 16 days of activism of no violence against women and children campaign. Yet to date, we're seeing 3 children being killed each day and 20 assaulted. Are we really failing our children? Let's talk more on this now and speak to child protection activist and for the Voiceless founder, Robyn Wolfson Vorster. Robyn, thank you so much for your time. I mean, we have these weeks where, you see National Child Protection Week, and soon we're going towards the 16 days campaign. Yet here we are again. Are we failing our children?
I fear that we are, Bungiwe. I think that this is a pattern that we haven't been able to end in any way, and there are a number of reasons for that. I think what we find is that government policy tends to focus very much around these campaigns, but we don't look at long-term interventions. And if you look at violence against children, there are many different systemic issues that lead to child deaths. They are some related to individuals, some related to the family, some related to communities, and some related to society as a whole. And unfortunately, unless we address all of those different levels, we're actually not going to see an end to the violence against children and to these horrific numbers of child deaths. What makes it even more horrific is, in fact, we know that these aren't actually accurate numbers, because what government does is they don't count the number of children who die through abandonment. Those children are considered to be stillborn and then abandoned thereafter. So in fact, if we were actually to calculate the numbers, including abandoned children, what we would see is far higher numbers. And until we start dealing with those systemic issues, we're actually not going to see an end to this level of violence against our children.
And you look at our constitution. I mean, it really, it holds in the highest regard the rights of equality and dignity for everyone. And of course, this includes children at the same time. And we're also seeing, of course, some of the family violence, child protection and sexual offences, units being launched and all of that. But is it all enough to be able to then, say that as South Africa, we are protecting our children enough? Where are we falling short if it's not?
So I think we have pockets of intervention, and many of those pockets of intervention are excellent. Unfortunately, we're not looking at it as a whole. So regrettably, until such time as we deal with major issues like poverty, like overcrowding, unemployment, the lack of hope that we see in many people, we probably are not going to see terrific ends to these kinds of numbers. But there are things that we could do. And what's frustrating is that often child issues get lumped in with other big issues. So if we look at the work that we're doing around gender-based violence, it's incredible. But then we slot children into that work. We actually need to be focusing on children as a whole. We also need to be looking at interministerial interventions, which look at the whole of South Africa. And unfortunately, there are many things that we could do which could stop the problem today, or at least certainly cut down on the numbers. For example, what we could do is we could increase the number of social workers that we have in this country, and we could diminish their workload. Because one of the things which is devastating if you work in child protection is you realize that actually many of these deaths are infinitely preventable. If there's early intervention, we get warning signs, people are involved in understanding what the problems are, but there's nobody to intervene. And there's no safety net in terms of our child protection mechanisms. The foster care system has been broken for a long time. So what happens is these children end up falling between the cracks. And when they die, it's predictable and it could have been stopped. But actually we haven't intervened in time. And so I think that's one of the things that we desperately need to do. We need to increase our number of social workers. We need to increase the child protection systems that they can be taken care of. And we need to ensure that we don't restore children back into family reunification programs until such time as there's been real intervention in families that are in crisis.
And there have been, some that say that, even if you increase the number of social workers, you also need to, really look at their training as well, because they find different scenarios on the ground and they're encountered by different situations and sometimes overwhelming them and not being able to respond?
Absolutely. And I think this has been a tremendous problem that we've had. What is devastating is we have all these social workers who are actually sitting at home at the moment. They've been well trained. What they need is to be given jobs. They need to be mentored. They need to be working in community programs where they actually can intervene directly in children's lives. The number of stories that I have told over the years where a neighbor, an auntie, somebody has warned of the fact that a child was in tremendous danger and about to die. And unfortunately, the social workers have been slow, as you say, potentially. They haven't understood the problem correctly. They haven't intervened. Or alternatively, they've removed the child, they've put them into care, and they've reunified them too quickly with their family. And sometimes those children end up dead, which is absolutely devastating. And again, there are things that we could do. It's not just the social workers. We could look at legislative changes today that, for example, could ensure that we have safe relinquishment of babies, which would stop the number of abandonments being so high. And those are things that we could do as government and as civil society to ensure that women who are in crisis, who feel that they can't raise their children, they're given options. Because the number of sad stories we hear where a woman has said, I don't want to parent, she's been forced to parent, that child has then been abused, and unfortunately, sometimes those children have ended up dead.
And I suppose in the same breath, also strengthening the non-profit organizations, because currently, you know, some of them are under-resourced and overwhelmed. And you look at COVID-19, some of them have had their budgets slashed.
Yes, that is a real problem that we're experiencing, where accreditation has been withdrawn or removed, where organizations are struggling with their fundraising, they're struggling with getting money out of government. And this is one of those situations where we actually just need more people to intervene rather than less. And we need community organizations to address specific problems. You look at gang violence, you look at some of the problems of vulnerability in communities. You walk into any informal settlement and they'll say to you, this is the place where the women get raped and the children get abducted and murdered. The communities know. So what we want is huge interventions in terms of allowing those NGOs who work in the space every day with those communities to be able to do their jobs. And for that, they need funding and they need to be empowered by government.
And I wonder, what are your thoughts on this one? Because others, you know, say that when you look at some of the family violence and sexual assault, units within SABC are doing one thing, and it's a good job. You know, some are saying that they're seeing the results, they're seeing that there's a much more focus on this one. But do you think it's time to also look at a much more focused approach, as you say, because if we're ignoring child abandonment as well, it's not speaking to the holistic picture, and go back to the child protection units possibly?
I think that focused approach is going to be key to actually solving this problem. And what we can't have is pockets of intervention. So, as I say, what happens is unfortunately children's issues they slip between the cracks. They straddle a whole lot of different government departments and areas in the SABC. And we also know that there is really patching policing. So in some communities, there's a lot of intervention when there is a crisis, but in others, those children are left so vulnerable. And until such time as we address that, and we address some of those bigger issues, like how are we addressing patriarchy? How are we addressing violence against women and children? How are we addressing all of those systemic issues that are going to continue to cause violence to be a part of our lives? Are we rather focusing on individuals, which is much easier to do, rather than looking at actually stopping the problem at its tracks and at source? And I think that is, and until such time as we can do that, we are always going to see these small wins, but long-term problems, and long-term we're going to see our statistics fare so poorly versus international statistics when it comes to child homicide.
I hope, of course, one really hopes that we can see speedy action in that regard. But thank you so much, Robyn, for your time. We appreciate it. That was a child protection activist and for the Voiceless founder, Robyn Wolfson Vorster.